Number 1.
The greatest trick that Irmgard Keun never played was convincing the world she didn't exist. Once an acclaimed German novelist, the then 31-year-old Keun had been living the life of an exile in either France or the Netherlands since 1936. 3 years earlier, the Nazis had condemned her enormously popular recent novels, which dealt with subjects like independent women in Berlin's seedy underworld, as anti-German. Keun was in Holland in 1940, when the fascists began their occupation of the Netherlands. With apparently nowhere left to turn, she took her own life, or so a British newspaper reported in August of the same year. But the story was false. Keun had used it as cover to return to Germany to see her parents. When you're that good at disappearing, sometimes you can't help staying hidden. Keun lived in obscurity until the 1970s, when her books were rediscovered by a new generation of German readers. The young Germans of the 70s were trying to reckon with their nation's horrific past, which many of their parents were directly implicated in, so Keun's steadfast refusal to conform to Nazi strictures during the Third Reich must have come as an inspiration to them. Recent English translations are now introducing those works to a broader audience and restoring Keun's status as a unique, fearless novelist of interwar Germany. Her stories of average Germans, mostly young women, attempting to make their way in the world despite fascism are refreshingly ironic, unless, of course, you're the fascist being belittled. Keun's disappearing act, amid the general chaos of Germany in the interwar and post-war periods, makes piecing together the author's life a bit of a challenge. Award-winning translator Michael Hoffman has produced 2 recent English-language versions of Keun's novels, yet is still unsure of her life story. Definite biographical facts about Keun are very thin, he admits. We know that Keun was born in Berlin in 1905 and began her professional life as an actress around 1921. She later turned her attention to writing, publishing the novels Gilgi, One of Us in 1931, and The Artificial Silk Girl in 1932. Both sold well, making Keun rich and famous. In a contemporary review, the New York Times praised Gilgi's freshness as standing in delightful contrast to the books written by men. But popularity came with a price. The Artificial Silk Girl tells the story of a young woman in contemporary Berlin who resorts to prostitution and theft on her quest to become a cabaret star. The Nazis had come to power the same year the book was published and disapproved of it vehemently. As one critical reviewer wrote, Keun produced vulgar aspersions against German womanhood, which were quite incompatible with Nazi ideas of refinement. Anything like an autonomous woman was anathema to the Nazis, Hoffman observes. Accordingly, Keun was blacklisted. She despised them, Hoffman says of Keun's feelings towards the Nazis. To her, they were idiots dressing up in uniforms and shouting and goose-stepping about the place. Following her blacklisting and unsuccessful attempt to sue the Gestapo for the loss of income resulting from their confiscation of her work in 1933, Keun fled Germany for expatriate life, shuttling between France and the Netherlands. She joined other German writers in exile, like Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, and Joseph Roth, all whom had likewise run afoul of Nazi censors. Unlike the historical fiction produced by those men, Keun's work in exile remained focused on daily realities, becoming more and more explicitly political, though always with an ironic edge. In After Midnight, published in 1937, a young woman falls in love with her cousin, only to have her aunt sabotage the relationship by informing the police that the protagonist has insulted Nazi leader Hermann Göring. Keun continued publishing, but the instability of exile, Nazi censorship preventing her from reaching German readers, and the growing certainty of war diminished her audience. Her small circle of fellow exiles and Dutch readers was minuscule compared to Keun's former readership. The Artificial Silk Girl had sold nearly 50,000 copies before being banned. Hoffman estimates that her subsequent novels reached less than 5% of those readers. When news began circulating that she had killed herself, it certainly wasn't unbelievable. She was still in Holland in 1940, and her suicide was announced in a British newspaper, says Hoffman of Keun. Somehow, she took advantage of that, got some false papers, and went back to her parents just across the border, in Cologne. The finer details of this episode remain unclear. Whether Keun intentionally worked with an editor to place a false story, or whether she merely took advantage of a bureaucratic error due to the Nazi invasion, the fiction of her untimely demise persisted. How she thereafter crossed the border between the Netherlands and Germany, whether by obtaining papers through the seduction of a Nazi officer or straightforward forgery, is also a mystery. Regardless, Keun, or Charlotte Trallow as became her nom de plume, was back in Germany. Keun's riveting return home has parallels to her novel Ferdinand, the Man with the Kind Heart. Written in 1950, Ferdinand is the story of a conscripted soldier who returns to Cologne from a prisoner of war camp to grapple with post-war life. In Keun's signature ironic yet endearing style, the novel offers readers a glimpse of Germans amid the rubble and rations, women hoarding for sport, and men celebrating their proof of denazification. Germany is supposedly returning to normal, but Ferdinand, the narrator, just wants to return to living. When I got back to Germany from camp, I still wasn't a private individual. I wasn't any Herr Timp, Ferdinand Timp. I was a returnee. To be honest, I can't stand the word returnee. It sounds a bit like the name of a vacuum cleaner or something. Something maneuverable. Gets in the corners and edges. It has something that smells of home and being looked after. Home for the homeless, home for fallen women, home for convicts, home for neglected children. Unlike the defeated former Nazis or belatedly victorious anti-fascists, Ferdinand does not want to be part of the political life of Germany. He admits that, during Hitler's rise, he was not involved in either their coup nor the opposition, and was only dragged into the war. Now that World War II is over, he sees the Cold War simmering. Germany was formally divided between East and West in 1949, and once again wants no part of it. He wants to be a person, rather than a political subject. This insistence on independence, however, does push the reality of collective crimes like the Holocaust out of sight, where it is ignored by both Ferdinand and Keun. He's charming, woozy, passive, says Hoffman of Ferdinand. Social and political movements mystify him, leave him indifferent. He's like a speck of saffron swept up by a magnet, along with all the iron filings. Published for the first time in English 2020, Ferdinand was Keun's final novel. She spent the remainder of her life in or around Cologne, where she would die in 1982. Her former literary fame eluded her until the 1970s, when her books began to be reissued in German. English translations, some by Hoffman, some by his late colleague Anthea Bell, began appearing in the 2000s, and the literary world once again praised Keun as a unique voice amid interwar German writers. The tragedy of this recent praise is that Keun faced such stark consequences in her own time for her novels. While the Nazis undoubtedly spared few of their victims, foremost the Jews that Ferdinand forgets, Keun puts into his mouth a pair of lines that might have been reserved to summarize the absurdity that defined her career. It's not so easy to write a love story in today's Germany. There are strict laws.
Number 2.
Antoine De Saint-Exupery, world-renowned author of The Little Prince and other important works of literature, also was an aviation pioneer who lost his life under mysterious circumstances during World War II. Born in Lyon, France in 1900, he was the scion of an aristocratic family and grew up in relative comfort, although he became accustomed to heartbreak as his beloved younger brother François died of rheumatic fever at just 15 years old. Antoine was a student during World War I, and he joined the French military in 1921. His first posting was to the cavalry, but ever since taking his first airplane flight in 1912 he had wanted to be a pilot. Securing transfer to the French Air Force, Saint-Exupery soloed for the first time in a Sopwith triplane, and so earned his pilot's wings. Thus began a love affair, amounting to an obsession with flying, that would last for the remainder of his life. After a short posting to Morocco and North Africa, Saint-Exupery left the Air Force, but he did not stop flying. Early in 1923 he crashed his airplane and suffered a skull fracture. Undeterred, he began a career as a male pilot, flying all over Western Europe and North Africa. His love for the desert and the people who lived there led Saint-Exupery to become director of an airfield in the Western Sahara. From there he flew throughout the region, among other things rescuing pilots whose aircraft had gone down in the harsh and forbidding region. The skills he learned in this work would come in handy later on. In 1929, Saint-Exupery moved to Argentina, where he became director of an airmail line. He also began writing, publishing his first two novels, Southern Mail and Night Flight, based on his own adventures. His greatest adventure, though, came in 1935, when he attempted a flight from Paris to Saigon in French-ruled Indochina and bid to beat the airspeed record for that distance. His aircraft, a Caudron Simon Touring monoplane, crashed in the Sahara after 20 hours of flight. Saint-Exupery and his navigator had nothing but a little wine, a thermos of coffee, a couple of oranges, grapes, and a bit of chocolate with a few crackers. After 4 days they were nearly dead, until a desert tribesman rescued them. The experience would become the central event in Saint-Exupery's 1939 memoir Wind, Sand, and Stars. When World War II began in 1939, Saint-Exupery was in the process of recovering from severe injuries he had received in yet another aircraft crash in Guatemala during the previous year. He nevertheless applied for, and was accepted as a reconnaissance flyer in the French Air Force, using a two-engine Block 174 aircraft. After the collapse of France, he fled to the United States, spending the next couple of years there, and in Canada advocating for the liberation of his country from German occupation, and also denouncing the Vichy French rump state that collaborated with the Nazis. It was during his time in the United States that Saint-Exupery wrote The Little Prince, which was published there in 1943. Saint-Exupery was desperate, not just to return to the air, but to rejoin the fight for his homeland. Yet he was 43 years old, with a bevy of injuries that left him unable to turn his head to the left, or even to dress without assistance. Saint-Exupery was a figure of international renown, however, whose participation in Free French military efforts would have tremendous publicity value, and so it was inevitable that his repeated applications to return to service would be granted. He therefore returned to service in North Africa as a reconnaissance pilot in April 1943, flying an F-5B variant of the P-38 Lightning. A crash on his second flight boded ill for Saint-Exupery's future, but he was nevertheless ushered back into service after recuperating. On July 31, 1944, in preparation for the impending Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, Saint-Exupery took off from an airfield on the island of Corsica to take reconnaissance photographs in the area of Grenoble, France. He never returned. 8 days later, Saint-Exupery was officially declared missing in action, presumed shot down by the enemy. Exactly what happened remains a mystery. In 1998, a French fisherman found Saint-Exupery's identity bracelet in the ocean off Marseille, and 2 years later divers found the remains of his aircraft in the same area. This led to the rediscovery of reports from August 1944 of the discovery of a body that could not be identified, but was in French uniform washing ashore nearby at that time. Yet this location was far off Saint-Exupery's flight path. Although there were reports, never confirmed, that a German pilot had shot down an aircraft like a P-38 in the area on July 31, underwater archaeologists were unable to find any evidence of damage from enemy action in the remains of the aircraft. Regardless of how he met his fate, Antoine De Saint-Exupery's dedicated service to his country during World War II offered a fitting capstone to his literary work, which continues to delight young and old to this day.
Number 3.
After passing the bar exam and becoming a qualified barrister, Oscar Zeta Costa was introduced to a nascent movement embracing the new cultural and political categorization of Chicano, according to L.A. Taco. Originating in the 1960s, the Chicano movement, the name of which is derived from the reclamation of an anti-Mexican American slur, fought to celebrate and make visible Mexican American identity on its own terms. Instead of only recognizing their Spanish or European background, Chicanos now also celebrated their indigenous and African roots, according to history, while activists also worked to fight oppression and prejudice in society, the world of work, and the American legal system. Acosta, who was by all accounts a highly intelligent and charming presence, became instrumental in bringing greater attention to the Chicano movement through speeches at rallies. He also used his legal abilities in high-profile cases, such as that of the East Side 13, who in 1968 faced 666 years in jail between them for their roles in the East LA blowouts, a huge student walkout of Mexican Americans to demand better education, per the Los Angeles Times. According to organizer David Sanchez, Acosta was working as a waiter in Aspen when he saw footage of the protesters fighting with police. Oscar said he took off his apron, threw it down on a table and announced, "Those people need a lawyer?" Then he drove to LA, per the same source. The specter of what might have been if Oscar Zeta Costa had continued to be a force for good into middle age and beyond, he was just 39 when he went missing, is always close by and discussing the Chicano hero. There was such potential in that man, states Anne Henry, portrayed by Krista Hax-Thawson, in the trailer for The Rise and Fall of the Brown Buffalo, a documentary about his life, which also describes Acosta, one of his generation's most forceful critics of white supremacy. Things changed for Acosta after his portrayal in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Though the book centers around Acosta's hedonistic tendencies, his friendship with Hunter S. Thompson is also a reminder that his first love, before law, was literature, and it was to this he returned after being reinvented, somewhat against his will, as a cult icon. Fear and Loathing erased Acosta's racial identity, describing him as a 300-pound salmon. As reported in LA Taco, Acosta threatened to sue and use the legal wrangle to leverage himself a book deal with Thompson's publisher. Whenever he set out to do something, he went at it full force, Acosta's son, Marco, told the Los Angeles Times. Acosta quickly released 2 books featuring the Chicano movement and Mexican-American identity as major themes, Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo and The Revolt of the Cockroach People, in 1972 and 1973, respectively, before he vanished a year later. According to LA Taco, the last known person Oscar Zeta Costa was in contact with was his son, whom he had telephoned to tell him he was in Sinaloa, Mexico. He was never heard from again. To this day, there has been no evidence of his fate, or any sign of whether he is alive or dead. His family now believes that the latter is more likely, though as Jatinja.com writer Sherma K. Bass notes, they don't speculate anymore. They simply accept that the Machinic Bison's fate remains one of the more schizoid mysteries of American subculture. Because the truth is, speculation is all we have to go on, even though many theories have been forwarded over the years to explain Acosta's sad disappearance. In the 1977 article for Rolling Stone, The Banshee Scream for Buffalo Meat, from which the quote which opens this article is taken, Hunter S. Thompson takes it upon himself to hunt for his erstwhile friend, and like the recent Brown Buffalo documentary, Thompson suspects that Acosta may have been killed during a drug deal. Drugs and alcohol consumed him, claims LA Taco, which has given rise to the theory that a mental breakdown might account for his disappearance, but also suggests he may have been assassinated to neutralize his political power. Acosta's disappearance remains uninvestigated by official channels to this day.
Number 4.
Solomon Northup was an African-American writer best known as the author of the 1853 best-selling memoir 12 Years a Slave, about his personal experience as a slave. In 2013, his book was adapted into an award-winning film starring the likes of Chiwetel Ejiofor and Lupita Nyong'o. But one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the life of Solomon Northup is his death. Sadly, sometime after the year 1857, he just disappeared, never to be seen again. However, the exact date, location and circumstances of his death are unknown. What historians don't know about the author of 12 Years a Slave is when and how he died and where he is buried. It's a lingering mystery in the final chapter of the life of the 19th century freeborn African American, whose compelling account of enforced slavery in pre-Civil War Louisiana was made into the Oscar-winning film of the same title. That's sort of a big blank spot in the story, for sure, said Rachel Seligman, co-author of Solomon Northup. The complete story of the author of 12 Years a Slave, published last year. This month, 12 Years a Slave took home the Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Supporting Actress. The accolades have sparked new interest in Northup's story, which was little known until recent years even in the upstate New York communities where he spent most of his life. Northup was born July 10, 1807, in what is now the Essex County town of Minerva, in the Adirondack Mountains. His father, a former slave, moved the family to neighboring Washington County, eventually settling in the village of Fort Edward, on the Hudson River 40 miles north of Albany. Northup married Anne Hampton in the late 1820s, and the couple lived in an 18th-century house in Fort Edward that is now a museum. Northup worked on his father's farm and rafted timber on the Champlain Canal between Fort Edward and the southern end of Lake Champlain. The couple and their children moved to nearby Saratoga Springs when Anne got a job in one of the growing spars or town's big hotels. Northup found work as a musician, and in 1841, two white men lured him to Washington, D.C., with the promise of more work. Instead, they kidnapped him and took him to New Orleans, where he was sold into slavery. Northup endured the next 12 years enslaved on a Louisiana cotton plantation, before friends in Saratoga finally won his freedom. In 1853, he published a memoir of his ordeal that led to a speaking tour supported by abolitionists. He got involved in the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves find freedom in the Northeast and Canada. But around 1863, the height of the Civil War, he dropped out of sight and was never heard from again. Even the movie notes at the end of the date, location and circumstances of Northup's death remain unknown. Theories abound about what may have happened to him. One scenario has him being captured and killed while serving as a spy for the Union Army. The man who helped rescue him said he believed Northup had taken to drink and was kidnapped yet again. Or Northup could have died in a place where no one knew him, or cared to properly bury an African American at a time when a war over slavery was tearing the nation apart. He may have just wandered around from place to place and died somewhere nobody knew who he was, and he was buried in a potter's field, said David Fisk, co-author the 2013 Northup book, along with Union College professor Clifford Brown. There's no paper trail for him, Brown added. Fisk said Northup's descendants also couldn't provide any documents or hard facts, so he has followed numerous threads while trying to track down where Northup may have been buried. He checked cemeteries in communities outside Saratoga and other upstate communities where Northup's wife and their children later lived, but came up empty. No death records have ever been found for him. Fisk, a former state librarian, points out that death records weren't kept in a systematic form in New York until the 1880s. For Seligman, a museum curator at Skidmore College, host of this July's annual Solomon Northup Day, the mystery surrounding Northup's demise and resting place is part of the allure of being a historian. It's what keeps historians going, she said. It's just a puzzle to be solved.
Number 5.
Theories abound about Poe's death, but there has yet to be one that proves definitive, a fittingly mysterious end for the master of mystery. No subject regarding Edgar Allan Poe ignites as much controversy as his sudden death at the age of 40, which remains shrouded in mystery. What we know is that Poe planned a trip from Richmond, Virginia to New York City, during which he traveled by steamer, and stopped in Baltimore on September 28, 1849. His actions and whereabouts throughout the next 5 days are uncertain. Was alcohol involved? On October 3, 1849, printer Joseph Walker found Poe inside, or near Gunner's Hall Tavern, and sent a note for J.E. Snodgrass, one of Poe's acquaintances in Baltimore. Walker described Poe as appearing in great distress. Snodgrass noted that the clothes Poe wore looked disheveled and out of place. He had evidently been robbed of his own clothing, or cheated in an exchange. Snodgrass and his uncle, Henry Herring, both presumed that Poe was in a drunken state, and agreed to send him to Washington College Hospital. Once there, Poe was taken to a room reserved for patients who were ill due to intoxication. Poe lapsed in and out of consciousness for the next few days, and according to Dr. John J. Moran, who questioned Poe about his condition, Poe's answers were incoherent and unsatisfactory. Moran also prevented visitors due to Poe's excitable condition. Moran later noted in a letter to Maria Clem, Poe's mother-in-law, that during a period of consciousness, Poe held vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. His face was pale, and his whole person drenched in perspiration. Poe died quietly before sunrise on Sunday, October 7, 1849. It may be logical to assume that alcohol played a role in Poe's death, given that it intermittently surfaced as a negative influence during his adult life. But how does it explain why Poe was wearing somebody else's clothes? Nor does it provide any insight into the circumstances that caused him to be found in such an unfortunate state. Was Poe a victim of cooping? One of the most popular theories about Poe's death stems from the fact that Poe was found on Election Day and Gunners Hall was a polling location. It is possible that on that day, Poe fell victim to cooping, a common method of voter fraud in the 19th century. Cooping victims were kidnapped, drugged or forced to drink, and disguised several times in order to cast several votes. Others have suggested that perhaps Poe was beaten and robbed, or even that he contracted rabies. Theories abound about Poe's death, but there has yet to be one that proves definitive, a fittingly mysterious end for the master of mystery.